Hello, all. Good evening, and welcome to our lecture series on English literature, history of English literature in brief. By the way, we are talking about this very particular topic, keeping the net and set examination into our focus, and based on that, we are trying to cover up with a few of the other lessons so far. We have started talking about this from Old English literature till now. We have talked about so much of neoclassical period, the Augustan period, and now we also in our previous two lecture series we have talked about Age of Sensibility, right? Now, after talking about those mini lectures and about the particular things in detail, we are going to commence with our again one of the remarkable period in history of English literature, that is none other than Romantic period. But before we move to Romantic period, let us have a brief outlook of what we have discussed so far in history of English literature, while focusing on particularly the the very interesting factor of our understanding the English literature that got produced. What were the major works? Age of Sensibility, exactly. Now, when we are on the verge to commence with Romantic period, we need to talk about the precursors of this Romantic period, the prominent authors who have played a key role in shaping the ideas, thoughts, and the entire movement of Romantic period somehow, right? Now, when we started talking about Age of Sensibility, now for next 10 to 15 minutes, we are going to have a brief overview about the Age of Sensibility, what we have discussed in Age of Sensibility, what kind of themes were there, what kind of tone of literature was there, the literature that got produced, the ideas that got greatly emerged in this period particularly, and how it stand as one of the elements, an epoch that is somehow where many of the great critics with their critical perception have tried to say that this period remains a kind of like a significant factor in case of talking about the beginning of you know Romantic period, because this Age of Sensibility somehow it is always greatly said that has created a foreground for the Romantic period. The critics, the authors, the poets, novelists, the fiction writers who were there in Age of Sensibility, exactly, their approach towards emotion, feelings, moralism, exactly, could be seen somehow as a result of excessive neoclassical ideas, right? And so, at the end of the neoclassical period, also, the commencement of this Romantic period is started from the publication of lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge together. So it is their collaborative work that got produced, and from there the Romantic period has commenced, which is somehow the time span when we talk about of this very particularly you know in a way about the Romantic period. Exactly, we come across this very interesting factor about this period where which is remarkably labelized with 1798, somewhere where the lyrical ballads got published by William Wordsworth. Right, now, when we talk in a detailed way about the age of sensibility, we have to pay attention at this very period, because it remains this period plays a kind of like a vital role in case of talking about the various commencement of certain period, right? Why this period is called when we talk about now, this period particularly plays a role of in a way drawing. This period plays a key role because it bridges in a way between what was there in neoclassical period, exactly, and what is going to be there in Romantic period, right? Now, in yesterday's lecture, we also have seen what was there in exactly neoclassical period is an era which, in a way, tried to bring order, exactly. More of value was given to reason, exactly, and the decorum, right? So, in a way, also wit was there that was greatly cherished by this neoclassical period. So, when we talk about neoclassical period and impact of this neoclassical period, it remains very significant. Upon no, now compared to totally opposite to that, exactly, we could be seen with Romantic period where there was a lot of value to imagination. What role it plays? Imagination, exactly, it is more of about fancy, exactly, where Coleridge has played a kind of a great role in discussing about those factors, right? So imagination, fancy, exactly, it goes more with individuality, exactly. Yes, focuses more on countryside area, right? Talks more about nature and the especially the elements from nature, exactly. There is, it can be seen, the more of a liberal approach to the form, exactly. Yes, whereas here form, or in a way order, had got a great amount of importance. Now among these two different periods, one is neoclassical period and the other is romantic period. Now this age of sensibility, exactly, stands totally different, exactly. So it is an age that sensed something, that talked more about feelings, exactly, in a way. Yes, feelings do have a value. It talked about sentiments, exactly. It talked about, in a way, the uh, psychology of morality, exactly. So when it was to talk about a virtue, exactly, this virtue was in a way characterized by the sympathy, exactly. So the more you sympathize about, the more you sympathize about certain things, the more you try to sympathize yourself with so many things, that became, kind of a crucial matter. And accordingly you find people who talked about wit, who talked about suffering, who talked about death, who talked about melancholy, who talked about immortality, exactly. Nothing belongs to us, the idea of alienation, exactly. So in a way, those many ideas got emerged, who in a way kind of played a key role in creating a foreground for romantic ideas. So here, when we try to switch from neoclassical period, exactly, neoclassical period to, in a way, from neoclassical period to otherwise romantic period, it is much more of importance to have a look at those matters where, I'm sorry, when we try to switch from neoclassical period to romantic period, we need to focus on exactly the time span. Okay, that is seen exactly very particularly from 17 somehow 58, or let's say 48 to 1790. Exactly, this period remains very important because it highlights the age of sensibility, right? And so exactly we have got prominent figures who have played a kind of a key role in case of shaping this, right? So when we are going to talk, when we are going to talk about romantic period, we are also going to talk about the precursors of the precursors of this romantic period, exactly, who already have played, exactly, who have played a succeeding role, right? Their successful role in shaping the foundations of romantic period and their ideas. So somehow feeling, so extreme order, exactly, being stick to the form, use of heroic couplet. Now it's a complete opposite, use of blank verse, exactly, could be seen in age of sensibility, right? So the moral sensation, exactly, the approach of, the didactic approach instructing the society could be seen greatly appealing, exactly. So more of humanizing the literature could be seen done in age of sensibility, humanizing the literature, exactly, coming up with the literary thoughts and ideas, exactly, producing a literature that is more of appealing to the human psychology, trying to explore something that is close to the human heart, exactly. That kind of thing was there in age of sensibility. So when we try to focus on age of sensibility in a very sincere way, we need to know what kind of attribute it has, keeping the NEET and SET examination. Because people, if you remember, from the very first day when I start with my lectures, I always tell you that the nature of asking the question has got changed, but the content is same, right? So when you focus more on a content, what is existing there, we are able to find out the answers for all sort of questions. Their interlinkages matter the most. When we are aware about the work of Oliver Goldsmith, exactly, yes. So when we try to find out the work of Oliver Goldsmith, or when we try to find out the work of William Wordsworth, we are, we are quite familiar with his ideology, his criticism. We are able to, we are able to discern the answers very easily. We are able to find out the answers and solutions to the questions that have been asked in exam very particularly. So whatever we are asked in exam, we are able to find out the appropriate. At least we are able to gauge that these are not the these are not the options that are applicable as an answer to this question. So this at least somehow allows us to find out the right answer. So focusing on content and what has been discussed here is matter of great concern otherwise people, because this is how we are going to in a way achieve success in those net and set examination. So in a way, so guys, this was kind of like a brief background to what we have been discussing so far is age of sensibility, right? And onward we are going to commence with an interesting topic in history of English literature, that is none other than romantic period. Exactly, this romantic period in history of English literature exactly is not just a period, by the way. Yes, rather this romantic period is somehow considered as a movement. Exactly, it was a moment. Yes. Now, when we see the excessive neoclassical rules, looking at what was there in neoclassicism, neoclassical believed in rules. Exactly, rules, form, order, exactly, a wit, even which was quite structured, exactly, yes, and being quite criticism, exactly, use of in a way heroic couplet, exactly. Now talking about the subject matters, exactly, they were restricted to the certain strata of society, exactly, in neoclassical period. Now they're excessive, exactly. So all this in an excessive manner, we can say, exactly, in excessive manner resulted into coming up with in a way emancipation from all those restrictions, exactly. So what they longed for, especially exactly the romantic period authors, romantic period thinkers. And so when we talk about the commencement of romantic period, yes, when we are going to talk about what was the background to this romantic period, there are a lot many things that remain as a background to this romantic period, and they are very much significant according to me because they play a kind of a key role. Otherwise, in case of understanding the role of romantic period. So once we are able to find out how romantic period has commenced, we are able to understand, we are able to have a linkage between the authors, poets, the novelists who have played kind of a great role in romantic period very particularly, because what was an inspiration for them was definitely the commencement and their references to the historical identities that they have. So they are going, they must have gone back to neoclassical period and the thoughts that got discussed in neoclassical period, and then their contemporary social conditions. There are many social and in a way cultural and economical incidents that have shaped the thought that got greatly glorified in romantic period. So we are going to go through those social, economical, cultural factors too. Like, okay, because without understanding them, we won't be able to find out why this very particular thought process got greatly conceived in romantic period. Why this period, romantic period, in which nature, natural element, exactly, nature as not something just an element, but something which is happening around us, a biological element that is going with us, that is living with us, that is within us. Exactly, what is there within is exactly seen in nature, and so our life cannot be in. No, I cannot. Our life cannot be separated without nature. It is inseparable, right? A kind of a thought process that got prevailed in romantic period. So we are going to go through those various ideologies too that got greatly evolved in romantic period. Exactly, the period that ended by the reign of Queen Victoria. Exactly, now again various technological advancements, updations, they all in a way have created. Now when I dealt with you regarding history of literary criticism and theories, I told you very sincerely about this very interesting fact that whenever you try to find out something from, when you go to study the very particular period of history of English literature, you realize that that particular period has it's a foundations going back. The one period plays, in a way lays a foundation for the further period. So when you talk about romanticism, we have this excessive use of roles, restrictions, subjectivity, which became quite monotonous and it became limited. So it had to be freed from the clutches of neoclassical thoughts. That was the thought what the romantic period people had possessed with. And so the first generation of romantic period, it's considered exactly the two prominent figures, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Exactly. Before going to start discussing about the prominent figures in romantic period, let us try to understand what is romantic period, how it has started, and what is the historical background of this entire romantic period, in detail. This romantic period, people very particularly refers to the movement that flourished in Europe, particularly in Britain, from the late 18th century to the mid 19th century. It emerged as a powerful reaction against the Enlightenment, or which is called as the Age of Reason, otherwise, right? So, and also called as a Neoclassicism, which prioritized rationality, scientific inquiry, decorum, and order, while the Enlightenment celebrated human reason as the highest faculty. Exactly, where romanticism emphasized imagination, intuition, emotions, nature, and the individual spirit as their highest faculties. So this period which can be coincided with major historical upheavals that shaped the consciousness of writers and thinkers. The very first is the French Revolution. Now, while talking about age of sensibility, we talked about this French Revolution and American War of Independence, which laid in a way kind of an inspirational story for the French Revolution, very particularly. And the another you know uh, incident that cannot be left unnoticed is Industrial Revolution. Industrial progress, industrial development somehow made, come up with those thoughts that got well conceived in romantic period, right? These events profoundly influenced literature, which became a vehicle in a way for social, political, and spiritual expressions. So the French Revolution, the promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity, otherwise inspired many early romantics to envision a new world order, while the rapid industrialization simultaneously and the urbanizations prompted them to seek refuge in nature, rural life, and the idealized past. So, industrial revolution was at peak. Cities were getting crowded. Employment was available only in cities. So all of them were crowded in cities only, whereas countryside, villages, rural life was left abandoned. Exactly, it was abandoned, it was left abandoned, and nobody was there to take care of that. Otherwise, so going back to the nature, going close to the nature, going back to the rustic life was somehow, a kind of an environmental thought, ecological thought that can be seen. So this angle, which got quite prominent, which got quite popularized in 20th century or in the modern literature period, its foundations could be seen, its a track could be, we can trace back those thoughts getting conceived in 18th century, very particularly, where romanticism got greatly flourished. So in a way, we realize that the rapid industrialization and urbanization somehow is one of the reasons that has led to the thought that got prevailed, that is going back to the nature, living with rustic people, rustic life, the life of countryside people, and going close with nature. So there are a lot of descriptions about natural elements: sun, moon, earth, valleys, mountains, they all brooks. They all have got greater amount of importance. So a farmer working in a farm, exactly, a chimney sweeper, a shepherd, exactly, they become, in a way, the actual part of their discussions earlier. In the classical or neoclassical period, we can see the references of shepherds, and those were only the nominal references that have been there. But in romantic period, they were literally became the person of the poem, the topic of the poetry, and many poems describing their lives, their language, would be seen greatly evolved in romantic period. So somehow those social and political incidents, in a way, had paid kind of a great contribution for shaping the romantic period, in an interesting way. Moving further, let us try to understand the philosophy and spirit of romanticism. Romanticism, in a way, was not a single unified philosophy, but a broad, cultural and intellectual movement. Okay, at its core, we realize that it rejected the mechanical rationalism, and instead it celebrated the boundless capacity of human imagination. So we have S.T. Coleridge talking about fancy and imagination in his essay. Also, we have Wordsworth, who played a kind of a crucial role in discussing the role of imagination and emotions and feelings otherwise. So, romantics believed that truth could be grasped only through logic, but also, exactly, it is not the case where you grasp the truth only by logic, but through emotions, as they are the original, they are the true one, intuitions and aesthetic experience. So some of the essential philosophies underpinning the romantic literature include, exactly, the very first one is imagination as a creative power. Unlike the neoclassicals writers who saw imagination as an imitation of classical models, when it was imagination which considered as the highest creative skill, it was labelized as nothing but mere imitations by the classicals. Exactly, the imitation of classical modules when it was referred by the neoclassicals particularly. But there was romantics. There were romantics who regarded imagination as almost divine faculty that could create new worlds. And so we have got S.T. Coleridge, for example, who described imagination as the living power that shapes human experiences. There are human experiences, and when they are aligned or in association with imagination, are expressed in a better way, they create a kind of a different world, and they remain as a living power, right? So this remains very interesting part to realize how a complete contradictory shift can be seen from neoclassicals to the romantics, right? And so this period remains very interesting. Emphasis on emotion and subjectivity is again another philosophical dimensions that could be seen in romantic period. Romantic literature foregrounded the personal feelings, so passions and their inner life of the individual. So a chimney sweeper, a farmer, a sower, a shepherd, exactly, all those people who are working, exactly, the common people became the subject matter. Their voice became, the center of literature that got produced in romantic period. And this is the significance of romantic period that we need to notice, keeping, our Nathan said examination into mind. Now this shift led deeply to the confessional poetry and prose. Very particularly, nature became as a source of inspiration, right? For the romantics, nature was more, than a background. It was alive, spiritual, and a mirror of human soul. So we find Wordsworth defining nature as a god, exactly, and so we find Coleridge finding the soul in nature, exactly, nature as a soul. So we have got those interesting factors here where Wordsworth saw it as a teacher and healer of mankind. So he failed quite better when he was close with the nature, and such is the interesting factor, which we need to understand. Now further one we have is the interest in past and the supernatural. Somehow in romantic period only, or we can see this thought got greatly conceived when we talk about the precursors, medievalism, exactly, the revival of past, revival of history could be seen greatly, emerged in a romantic period. And so the medievalism, folklore, myths, and the Gothic were revived, partly as a critic of enlightenment rationality and partly as an exploration of mystery and imagination. So this is also one of the underlying factor of this romantic period which we need to note as, one of the contributory factor for the romantic idealism that got vehicled in the 18th century very particularly. Individualism and freedom. Romantic writers who were there, they celebrated the individual genius and outcast the rebel and the visionary. So they often defended artistic freedom against the rigid classical rule. So rather maintaining the form, decorum, language, exactly. So, in a way, for to elaborate this individualism freedom, where say they celebrated the individual genius. So when a sower would become a hero of a story, or he would become a central figure of a poem, it has to be described in his language, was kind of an assertion we see with romantic writers. And so it was quite completely opposite to the classical thought or neoclassical thought, that because it propagated very well that when you portray a central figure, if it is a king, he should speak the language of a king. Exactly, when you portray a soldier, he should speak the language of a soldier that is prevalent. So when it was portrayed, definitely when the peasant, exactly, a farmer working in a farm became the subject of a poetry, the poetry that got produced as a person, exactly, when the farmer himself was explaining his emotions through that poem, or he became the person of poem, the language that got used was the language of him. So this association somehow got fixed. So we can see the individual genius that got greatly worshipped and greatly practiced in romantic period. Idealism and revolution. Many romantics initially embraced political radicalism influenced by French Revolution and the ideas of democracy and equality that could be seen greatly with Wordsworth and also with Coleridge. Not that with Coleridge, but also with P.B. Shelley particularly. Now, what are the features of romantic literature? Let us try to understand the various features of this romantic literature. This romantic literature plays a kind of a key role, as we have been discussing. Lyricism and poetry are the central form. Poetry, in a way, when we try to understand the role of this very interesting factor, in a way, we need to pay attention at those interesting factors, how lyric and poetry became the central form. What is the best part of romantic period? Novel became quite popularized, but more than that, poetry got kind of a great amount of value because it got conceptualized by many great poets and critics in romantic period. So poetry became, we can say, poetry became the center of all literary figures that got produced otherwise, right? So it became the most important literary form, as it best expressed, which we can say as it best expressed emotions and uh, imagination otherwise, right? So, simple natural language. Again, Wordsworth, through his critical analysis and critical essays, or his commentary on how literature has to be, we can see talking more about the selection of language, exactly, nature of language, all this way. So, he argued that poetry should use the language of a man rather than artificial diction. Language of a man means when you are portraying the people, when the subject matter of your poetry is a simple man, a common man from a village, you have to talk in his language. Then it will be quite appealing you're describing. So it will be quite appealing, and then it will definitely sound, it will like quite natural that yes, a common man from a village is talking. It will not sound artificial. Themes of childhood and innocence. Childhood was idealized as a state of purity and closeness to the nature. So, in his discussion, lyrical ballads or privileged lyrical ballads, we find him, you know, talking in detail more about his being child, and so the descriptions of childhood, how he sees that childhood represents innocence and it is quite a divine. It is blessed with a lot of divinity. So it is the divine qualities. Sublime and mystery. Romantics were fascinated by the sublime, awe-inspiring experiences of nature, beauty, and terror that transcend ordinary understanding and celebration of the common man. Now, unlike neoclassicals, elitism, neoclassical figured, neoclassical promoted in a way more of the elite classes, the elite society, the aristocratic people. They were, the center of their discussion prominently in case of understanding the literature of neoclassical period. Unlike them, romantic writers, the romantics who were there, they were fascinated. The romantic literature gave much of its significance to the farmers, shepherds, and ordinary rural life. Now let's have a look at some prominent figures of this. Uh, of this romantic period. The first generation, we have got William Wordsworth, the first generation romantics, and he is considered as the father of English romantic poetry. His preface to lyrical ballads remains, again, an important writings in romantic period, and it set out the principles of romantic poetry. His works like Tinton Abbey and the Prelude focuses more on nature, memory, and personal growth. The second prominent figure of this romantic period at the at the threshold of this romantic period is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, S.T. Coleridge, who is known for his theories of imagination and for poems like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner or Kubla Khan, which combine supernatural elements with rich symbolism. As I said, somehow romantic literature or the style of romantic period can be seen the revival of medievalism or history. So elements like a supernatural powers or supernatural elements could be seen embedded into their poetry. So this is again an interesting factor which we need to be taken into consideration when we are highlighting more on the style of romantic literature or the prominent figures, those who did not just only talk about the style which is to be evolved through their essays but could be seen literally practicing through their writings only, and S.T. Coleridge is one of such a example. Then we have got second generation of romantics. We have got Lord Byron, who embodied the Byronic hero through the description. Exactly, a rebellious, passionate, and melancholic figure, and his works like Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and Don Juan are the prominent figures particularly. And so he says, I slept and overnight I became famous. So he got a lot of importance. He got a lot of popularity only after his publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Then we have got P.B. Shelley, a quite idealistic and a radical thinker and a visionary who wrote poems like Ode to the West Wind and Prometheus Unbound, championing his freedom revolution and the transformative power of imagination. Next to him, we have is John Keats, who is quite famous for his negative capability. Right, he's known for seriousness, senses, imaginary, and his concept. He explored beauty, transience, and art. Ode to Nightingale, Ode on Grecian Urn, and To Autumn are one of his famous and most popular works in Romantic period. Now, Romantic prose and essays, while poetry dominated, prose also got flourished during this Romantic period. By the way, we are going to talk about those figures in detail for sure in this lecture series itself. We are just going to have a kind of a brief background to what we have been discussing so far, right? So, before we move to what we have been discussing, let me clear it that this is just a brief account. We are just trying to have a brief account of the entire Romantic period. Once we are done with that, we are going to find out section wise many prominent figures of this period and what they were famous for, keeping the NET and SET examination into our vision. Now, talking about the people who have played a great role in case of selection of fiction, we have got Charles Lamb, who is quite famous for his essays of Ilya, and which is marked by warmth, intimacy, and a kind of a personal reflection. Then we have got William Hazlitt, a brilliant essayist, and a critic. He praised Shakespeare and defended the imagination and critiqued the political operation particularly. Then we have got Thomas De Quincey, who plays again a kind of a cold, uh, who plays again kind of a very prominent role, who is known for Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and who is blending autobiography, imagination, and psychological exploration. Now, romantic novel and gothic fiction. Now, Gothic novels, writers, we have got like Horace Walpole, who's the Castle of Otranto. Then again, an interesting figure, Anna Radcliffe, the Mysterious of Udolpho and Mary Shelley, playing a kind of prominent in Frankenstein, got published 1880, and explored the terror, supernatural forces, and human psychology are the prominent attributes of Gothic novel. Historical novel, they've got a very prominent figure, Sir Walter Scott, who popularized the historical novel, blending romance, history, and national identity in works like Ivanhoe or Waverley. Then we have got Jane Austen, who stands individually apart from the romantic writers, but definitely the thoughts that got prevailed in later part of romantic period could be seen greatly evolved, could be seen greatly exploring through her works. So, though often considered as a transitional figure, Austen's novels like Pride and Prejudice and Emma are blended with realism, irony, and keen social observation with romantic sensibility. Now, what were the themes and motives of the Romantic literature? Nature and sublime, mountains, rivers, forests, and seas were described you know, uh, with awe and reverence. Then something like imagination versus reason, where we find neoclassical celebrated a lot of reason, where instead of that, romanticism celebrated a lot of imagination. So literature privileged creativity and vision over rigid rationalism, freedom and revolution. As it is remarkable to see industrial revolution and French revolution, who remain and impactful incidents in history. For romantic period particularly, revolutionary thoughts could be seen greatly conceived in the literature that got produced in romantic period. So many work expressed hope for political liberty and social justice. Mystery and supernatural, as it is a revival of history or medieval period, we can see the gothic novels, and definitely ghost dreams and unexplained phenomena fascinated the romantics. Melancholy and mortality, it talked as it was more of its roots can be seen with Age of Sensibility, where mortality, death, melancholy could be seen greatly described by then the writers. So their predominant factor could be seen reflecting in romantic period also. So a sense of transience and nostalgia runs to the Keats and Shelley. Beauty and art. This it was valued as eternal, transcending the decay of life. So Keats' beauty is a truth, and truth is beauty is again a famous quote that talks more about So in a way, they are the prominent figures and greatest themes that were discussed in Romantic period. Now, legacy. Romantic literature revolutionized how art and literature were understood. It's a celebration of individuality and creativity inspired later movements such as Victorian poetry, the pre-Raphaelites, and even modern writers. So, Romanticism also lays the foundation for environmental consciousness by portraying the nature as a sacred and alive. So, moreover, the Romantic emphasis on subjectivity, personal truth, and freedom resonates even today in contemporary poetry, music, and art, particularly. So, it gave the world timeless concepts such as Wordsworth, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and Coleridge, imagination, Shelley's acknowledged legislation, and Keats' negative capability. So, in conclusion, of the introductory part of this romantic period, we can say that the romantic literature marked a profound shift in the history of letters. So, arising from the turbulence of revolution and industrial age, this it got rejected the classical norms and celebrated the imagination, individuality, and the power of nature. It's a poetry, the poetry of romantic period, prose of romantic period, and the novels reveal a deep concern for human emotions, freedom, and the mysteries of life. So, from Wordsworth's simplicity to Shelley's radicalism, from Coleridge's philosophy to Keats' beauty, Romanticism remains, in a way, one of the richest and most influential literary movements in the world. So this was all about the interesting factor, about understanding the role of romanticism, what role romanticism plays, and how interesting this part is. So this was just an introductory lecture. Now we are going to go to understand the prominent figures who have laid foundation through their ideologies, thoughts that uh, they expressed by the literature they produced, and it laid a foundation for the romantic movement otherwise, right? So it has a pre, actual, and post part when we talk about this romantic movement. Very interestingly, this romantic period is not just a period or a kind of a span of years which we could find out and study about, but it is kind of like a movement otherwise, which revolutionized the literary thoughts, the literary ideologies that got greatly evolved, and somehow it played a kind of a playing a contradictory role for the neoclassical thoughts that were greatly emerged and had got kind of a greater popularity in the very period where they had great impact on society. And romantic period is not just a period, but it's kind of a movement which we need to consider, right? So before we continue with our discussion on the prominent figures of this period, let us continue. Let us take a break for 5 minutes before we continue with what we have been discussing so far. Right. So let us take a break for 5 minutes and come back. to discuss about the further. No, we are going to talk about all the prominent figures we have talked about. By the way, let me revise you what we are talking about. We are talking about history of English literature, and within this history, we are focusing on an interesting period is uh, romantic period. Okay, now this is not just a period, but let us remind as it is a movement, right? So before we commence with talking about the prominent figures in romantic period, it is much more important to have a look at those interesting figures who kind of have played a key role in commencement of romantic period, which we can say who have laid foundation. So these are also the prominent authors and figures. Let's go and try to understand about them. These are the precursors and early influences of romantic period, anticipating the romantic ideas of emotion, nature, and imagination. The very first one we have with us is exactly James Thompson, who covers the span of 17 to 1748. His key work is The Season. James Thompson is often regarded as the earliest harbinger of romantic nature poetry. His long blank verse poem the seasons divided into four parts: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. It celebrates the beauty and moral influence of nature. Talking about innovations, he broke from the artificial conventions of Augustan poetry and turned to direct observations of the nature, describing landscapes, weather, and the cycle of seasons with freshness and sincerity. Talking about the themes, prominently nature as a living presence, the harmony between man and the natural world, and a spiritual awareness of creation are the certain themes that he handled through his works. Influence, we can see the influence of his natural descriptions, particularly on Wordsworth and Coleridge, who later deepen this treatment into a philosophy of nature, particularly. So, this poem, The Seasons, it paved the way for romantic love of countryside, rural life, and the natural scenery, replacing the classical rationality with emotional responsiveness. So, this James Thompson again remains an interesting factor for us in case of understanding the work that got produced. Moving ahead, we have got again an interesting factor. We talked about him in detail in yesterday's lecture for sure, but let us revise about him, who also played a kind of a pioneering, no, who played a kind of like a great role in case of understanding the fundamentalism of Age of Sensibility. Yes, and it is none other than Thomas Gray. His key work is Elegy written in country churchyard, which is quite famous again. He presents the melancholic and reflective strain that bridges the neoclassicism and romanticism. His elegy, written in a country churchyard, is one of the most beloved poems in English literature. Now, the content, he meditates on death, obscurity, and the simple lives of rural people buried in churchyard. Talking about the tone of his work, which is deeply emotional, melancholic, and personal. Talking about the style that he has possessed, uh, although formally disciplined, Gray's verse conveys genuine feeling and introspection. And so, from the early precursors or the influencers of romantic thoughts, we can find him as one of the key figure otherwise. So, the pre-romantic characteristics we can see a sympathy for humble and rustic life, meditation on the transience of life and inevitability of death. Exactly. So they talked more about death. They talked about more about mortality. Exactly. They talked about possession. Exactly. And detachment. We cannot have our permanent existence over here. So that life is not permanent and nobody is permanent or nothing in this world is permanent, and that's the only thought remains permanent. What's kind of a contradictory statement we have seen over here coming up with, and can seen greatly we discussed here. We can see his influence, particularly reflective and mournful tone influence Wordsworth and Coleridge's meditative poems such as the Tinton Abbey. Now, next interesting figure we have with us is William Collins, who covers the span from 1721 to 1759, almost for like 4 decades. Particularly, his key works are Odes on the Passions and Ode to Evening. He was one of the most lyrical and imaginative poets of the mid 18th century. His odes particularly anticipate, right? Now, talking about, let us have a list of those prominent figures. Uh, James Thompson. We have talked so far about James Thompson, right? So, let us make a list of them that we have been discussing so far. We have got James Thompson, who can be labelized as the initial figure, right? After to him, right? After to him, we have with us is Thomas Gray. Yes, again, an interesting factor for him, Thomas Gray, who is quite famous for his melancholic tone. And then we have got William Collins, right? Quite famous for his imaginative poet. So let us talk about William Collins first. His two prominent figures, Ode on Passions and Ode to Evening, are very famous, and he is one of the most lyrical and imaginative poets of the mid 18th century. His odes anticipate the emotional richness and symbolic power of romantic poetry. Now, talking about the style and themes, his rich musical language and spontaneous emotions. Exactly. So the style he followed is quite rich musical language and spontaneous emotions. Celebration of the imagination and the passions could be noticed, and personification of abstract emotions like fear, joy, and pity. Exactly, and so we find the same kind of personification later in Wordsworth's poetry and his further writings also. In Ode to Evening, he captures the tranquil mood of twilight, treating evening as a spiritual and almost divine presence. A theme later found in Keats' odes very particularly. So he remains again inspirational poet for the further key figures of romantic period, somebody like William Wordsworth or John Keats otherwise. And why he is important? He was among the first poets to turn inward, emphasizing personal feeling and creative imagination, both central to romantic art. Exactly. So, to labelize him, he can be seen the first poet to turn inward. To add to that, exactly. So, we can say first poet to turn inward. Moving further, we have got Thomas Chatterton. Exactly. Uh, His Rowley poems published posthumously 1717 to 1778. Thomas Chatton, known as the marvelous boy, became a symbol of youthful romantic genius. Exactly. So, talking about him, I'm sorry, Thomas Chatterton, who is known as marvelous boy and famous for symbolic of youthful symbol of youthful romantic genius. At just 17, looking at his background, at just the age of 17, he took his own life in poverty, and his tragic story inspired later romantics such as Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, right, and Keats. The Rowley poems, Chatterton created a fictional medieval priest named Thomas Rowley and attributed his own poems to this invented persona using archaic language to give them authenticity. So he created somehow this, the medieval priest. So it's a fictional character, and so he gave him an archaic, an ancient tone, so it would sound more realistic. So his significance of this that he anticipated the romantic fascination with Middle Ages, chivalry, and mysterious past, which could be seen greatly discussed in Romantic Age very particularly. He embodied the ideal of misunderstood, passionate, and doomed artist, and his death became a romantic legend symbolizing the price of creative genius. Next to him, again, we have got a very interesting figure with us is William Cowper, right? Who is quite famous for his gentle, domestic, and spiritual voice of pre-romanticism. So, his a long blank verse poem, "The Task" celebrates rural simplicity, nature, and quiet reflections very particularly. To talk about it, William Cowper, gentle, domestic, and spiritual voice. Spiritual voice. Looking on his themes, particularly love of the countryside and the moral lessons drawn from simple rural life. Again, now look at these themes. We are discussing them as the precursors or people who have influenced the romantic writers. So what we seen greatly discussed in romantic period is already existing with those writers. So William Cowper or somebody like James Thompson, exactly, or Chatterton are the prominent figures who play a kind of a key role. It is not just about them. There are a few more also who are added to this list who play a kind of a key role, right? So love of the countryside and moral lessons drawn from simple rural life are the only reflections that we see with writings in romantic period. Compassion, religious sensibility, and emotional sincerity are the prominent themes that we notice in his works. Looking at the style of him, natural and conversational style that he has used with writings, which departs from the artificiality of Augustan diction very particularly. And looking at his influences, his humble portrayal of nature and humanity has influenced Wordsworth's democratic and moral vision of poetry very particularly. Exactly. So one cannot rely on heart, or heart cannot work as a head for longer period of time. And so with this, we find William Wordsworth stating that poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings which are quite close to the heart, and so they are powerful, and they are recollected in tranquility. They are stored, and with the use of head, they are recollected in tranquility. So head and heart working together. So intelligence and artistic imagination is kind of a combination which we can see greatly discussed further. And so this discussion is somehow could be seen in its a foundations, or its a traces can be its elements can be traced back in age of sensibility. He is also remembered for his hymns and letters particularly, right? And let's say he is remembered for his hymns and letters, which show his deep introspection and human spirit. Then again, an interesting character we have is James Macpherson, who remains again from 1736 to 1796, playing a great role of almost 6 decades. Right, the poem of Ocean is the key work, is a prominent work. Macpherson claimed to have discovered and translated the ancient Gaelic poems of bard named Ocean. Though largely his own invention, these works, Fingal, Femora, etc., had an immense influence across Europe. What are the key features? Heroic narratives filled with witty, misty landscapes, melancholy warriors, and wild natural settings. Adding to that, romantic glorification of Celtic tradition, imagination, and emotion is definitely there. And looking at the impact of his writings, captivated the writers such as Goethe, Napoleon, and English romantics, and contributed to romantic nationalism and the revival of interest in native myth and legend. So now we have to have a great focus on those elements, keeping the NET and set examination into our vision, people, because without keeping them aside and focusing on only those parts wouldn't be a kind of a great help to us otherwise, right? Despite questions of authenticity, the poems of Ocean kindled a passion for the sublime, the ancient, and the mysterious, making of Macpherson an important pre-romantic figure. Again, an interesting character we have with us is William Blake. Exactly. Somehow we can be seen again a kind of a key figure, a key figure in romantic period itself or at the commencement of romantic period, but that could be seen as his ending part of his life. So, songs of innocence and experience, the marriage of heaven and hell. William Blake stands at the threshold of romanticism, often considered its a first true visionary. His poetry and art combine mysticism, symbolism, and imaginative freedom. Now, about his visionary imagination, William Blake rejected materialism and reason, proclaiming imagination as the divine body in every man. So, what romantics discussed greatly could be seen already handled by the uh, free writers who were there before the romantic period. Now, looking at the themes that he has handled so far in his writings, the contrast between innocence and experience, that is talking about childhood purity versus worldly corruption, spiritual freedom, and rebellion against oppression are the key themes that he has discussed so far, and nature as a living spiritual reality. What are his major works that are included? Looking at the Nathan's examination, Songs of Innocence and of Experience explores two states of human soul through simple yet profound lyrics. And the of the marriage of heaven and hell presents visionary philosophy, challenging conventional morality and celebrating creative energy. Its significance, Blake anticipated the romantic belief in imagination as a revelation. His works blend poetry, painting, and prophecy, creating a world of symbolic beauty and moral depth. And adding, he inspired later romantics like P.B. Shelley and Wordsworth, as well as later visionary poets and artists. Fine. So, uh, giving the summary of their collective influences prominently, we have got the figure of those prominent figures who play a kind of a key role. Let us have a kind of a brief summary. Exactly. So, to talk about aspect, nature, the pre-romantic development can be seen. Thomson and Cowper's nature poetry showed early reverence for the natural world, whereas we have got romantic contribution primarily from Wordsworth and Coleridge, who play kind of a key role in deepening this into the philosophy of nature. Then emotion and melancholy, well handled by Gray and Collins, emphasizing emotion and the reflective mood, uh, which we can see central to all the romantics poetry, especially in Keats and Byron, Lord Byron, when defining his Byronic heroism. Now talking about imagination and vision, William Blake made imagination divine and visionary. Further, we can see contributed by romantic poets celebrated imagination as the supreme creative power. Exactly. Prominently, Coleridge in his separate critical essay find talking about the importance of imagination. You know, so we have got these prominent figures who play a kind of a key role. Yes. Then nationalism and the past. Macpherson and Chatterton revived interest in Celtic and medieval traditions, and through their works and their writings, we can see, and further, which we can see in the fictional and prose part, continued by somebody like a Sir Walter Scott, then S.T. Coleridge and Keats, who pursued the same interest in religion and history. Again, one of the attributing factor or aspect is individualism and subjectivity. Personal feeling and inner experiences began to dominate the poetry as compared to neoclassical fiction, neoclassical writings, and neoclassical verse. You know, now in romantic period, it became the hallmark of romantic art and work. That is individualism and subjectivity. Moving further to conclude the pre-romantics, we have got like prominent figures like Thomson, Gray, William Collins, Thomas Chatterton, William Cowper, or James Macpherson, and William Blake. You know, they prepared the soil for the Romantic movement. So they challenged the classical restraint and emphasized on emotion over reason, and thus they celebrated, we can say, nature, imagination, and the individual spirit. Their works, all those authors so far, they represent a bridge from the age of reason to the age of emotion. Exactly. And here, when we labelize this, we can see this neoclassical can be referred as age of reason. Exactly. And here, uh, let's say pre-romanticism can be referred as age of emotion, right? Age of emotion. So, in a way, uh, it marked the dawn of the English Romanticism that would soon flourish through the Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Byron, Shelley, and Keats. So, in a way, these pre-romantic writers, pre-romantic literary contributors have played a kind of a key role, as it is greatly said that they have prepared a soil for the romantic period or romantic movement otherwise, and so their contribution remains very significant otherwise to be taken into consideration. So they have played a kind of a key role. Moving further to our period is that now we are going to talk about the major generation romantics from 1770 to 1850. Exactly the time span of almost in a way 45 years. Exactly, who established the foundations of English romanticism, giving nature, simplicity, and imagination as their primary themes or style of writing, particularly, or covering these topic into their writing prominently. So let us begin with our a very prominent and the most celebrated figure in English literature is none other than William Wordsworth. Now, when we talk about William Wordsworth, he is considered as the father of Romanticism because of his writing. He also is known as, the chief architect of English Romanticism. His poetry redefined the very purpose and language of poetry very interestingly. So it's not just through the writings. Otherwise, by the critical essays, he talked about the form and style of writing a poetry in Romantic period. But we can see the same thought he has practiced through the writings only. And so his major works include lyrical ballad with S.T. Coleridge in 1798. Uh, After the publication of the lyrical ballad, the commencement of Romantic period in official way is considered. Then again, his longest poem published, The Prelude, which was between 1798 to 1805, published in 1850 later, and Ode, Imitations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, got published in 1870. Right. His contributory themes is considered now philosophy of nature for Wordsworth. Like as we find, he got greatly influence from the pre-romantic writers. For William Wordsworth, nature was a living moral and spiritual force. He considered nature as a teacher and as a source of joy, also a source of wisdom, and he found the healing elements with nature. So, in his poems like Tintern Abbey and The Prelude, we find him portraying nature as a shaping the human soul and moral being. Now, talking about his lyrical ballad, it was co-authored with S.T. Coleridge. This collection is considered the manifesto of English Romantic poetry. In its preface, which was the 18th century edition, Wordsworth declared that poetry should use the language really used by men and express emotions recollected in tranquility. Now, while talking about this, when we had conducted the lectures in detail about discussing the critical analysis of his writings and his critical thoughts, we have talked about them in detail. Otherwise, you can just go through and have a look at those discussions that we had previously. Now, moving ahead, his another important work is The Prelude. It is his autobiographical masterpiece that traces the growth of his own mind in relation to nature and imagination, and it presents his inner spiritual journey and his developing consciousness. Right. So this is also again his a masterpiece, which is most popular and well celebrated by many English readers. Otherwise, his further work is Ode, Imitations of Immortality. It reflects his mature philosophy, the sense of spiritual loss as one moves from childhood's vision to adult realism, right? And yet, a faith in immortality of the soul matters the most. Now, talking about the style and significance, simple diction, rural themes, and emotional sincerity became the hallmarks of romantic poetry, and he established through his writings only about those understandings, right? And so he turned poetry inward, focusing on poets' personal experience and spiritual response, right? Making him the high priest of nature, very interestingly. So, according to him, poet had to play a kind of a key role in romantic period, very particularly, right? In which he completely changed the style of writing poetry, or either way, we can see him laying a great foundations in a different way. Otherwise, for the form of poetry, exactly the choice, the selection of language, the selection of themes, all those things remain very impactful in case of understanding that. Again, after William Wordsworth, the very prominent figure we have with us is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who accounts from 1772 to 1834. Exactly. His major works include The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, again, uh, one of the famous works that got published along with lyrical ballads, Kubla Khan in 1979 and published in 1816. Then Christabel and Biographia Literaria is one of the prominent literary work, critical work that he published. Now, here's a contribution and themes. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was both a poetic genius and philosophical thinker who combined a deep imagination with intellectual depth. Okay, and to add here, he is to be considered as a first critic to look at the criticism in a philosophical way. Exactly. So he put forth from the modern period, from the modern critics, from the row of modern critics, he is to be considered as the first one who criticized literature with a philosophical tone or with a philosophical dimension. So his intelligence could be experienced through his writings of Literaria Biographia, in which he has covered a lot many topics that he wished to discuss through, and could be seen greatly practicing. Somehow we find him going against a few thoughts of William Wordsworth too, but that's not of concern for us right now. So, supernatural and imaginative poetry. The rhyme of ancient mariner blends Christian symbolism, moral redemption, and the supernatural in haunting sea narrative. So, the rhyme of ancient mariners remains again one of the significant fact, as considering as one of the contributory attribute of romantic period is that revival of medievalism or revival of history. Exactly, the going back to the past or some gothic experiences could be seen, and so those notions could be read with what we have, with us in St. Coleridge writing, right? Kubla Khan is again a dream fragment that celebrates the creative imagination, where he portrays the mysterious power of artistic vision. Christabel again experiments with mystery, rhythm, and psychological subtlety, which prefigures the Gothic strain in Romanticism. As I said, as they remain as one of the key factors of Romantic writings, exactly Romanticism and the Romantic writings, particularly, they are to be experienced. They are to be we have a liberty to experience them. We have a chance to experience them through the writings of S.T. Coleridge. Now, it's a philosophical criticism in Biographia Literaria. Coleridge develops his theory of imagination, distinguishing between primary and secondary imagination. The primary imagination is the living power of human perception, the divine faculty in man, and we find him talking about the secondary imagination is poetic power that reshapes reality into art. Now, talking about in his Biographia Literaria, we find him, developing his theory of imagination, making a distinction between what is fancy and what is imagination, exactly, and so elaborating more about what is primary imagination and what is secondary imagination. So, according to him, the primary imagination is the living power of human perception, the divine faculty in a man, exactly, and secondary imagination is the poetic power that reshapes reality into art. But he says for secondary imagination, appearance or existence of primary imagination is matters. Now, talking about legacy, Coleridge deepened the romantic conception of imagination as a spiritual and creative faculty, right? So what we have seen with the pre-romantic writers, its influence and inheritance could be seen greatly with the writings of St. Coleridge. His exploration of dream, guilt, and redemption in depth influence the later poets and critics, and thus he stands as the philosophical pillar to Wordsworth's emotional realism, and making them the twin founders of English Romanticism. So he is from the first generation of romantic writers, or say first generation of romantic writers or poets who have played a kind of a key role in shaping the romantic manifesto otherwise. And so he remains again one of the influential factors so far, right? Moving ahead, we have got Robert Southey. Exactly. Southey also plays a kind of I'm sorry, Robert Southey. His major works add Thalaba the Destroyer, The Curse of Khayyama, and Redrick the Last of the Goths. His themes, particularly, though less revolutionary in imagination than Wordsworth or Coleridge, was a prolific poet, biographer, and historian. His Oriental and mythological themes, his epics such as Thabla the Destroyer and Curse of Khayyama, drew upon Arabic, Indian, and Oriental mythology, right? anticipating the romantic fascination with exotic and mysterious way, right? He combined, his writings particularly combine moral allegory, supernatural adventure, and vivid imaginary. So, patriotism and social concern. As a poet laureate from 1813 to 1843, Savdi wrote nationalistic poetry celebrating Britain's heritage and moral values. So, his prose works, including historical and biographical writings, presented, expressed his moral earnestness and humanitarian concern. Now, talking about style, quite elevated, rhythmic, and imaginative, though sometimes verbose. Right now, talking about significance of his writings, Saudi's wide interest and experiments in a verse narrative helped expand the range of romantic poetry, while his Oriental tales parallel Byron's later Eastern romances. Right. So, before we move to our further figures so far, what we have started with is, let me tell you in our today's session, right? Let us summarize what we have discussed so far in our today's session and conclude our today's discussion on this note, right? For information, we started talking about in our today's session. We talked about. Let us make a great summary over here for what we have talked so far. Exactly. In our today's lecture series, in this entire lecture, we had a, uh, in a way, brief summary of age of sensibility. We talked about age of sensibility and how age of sensibility has laid a foundation for the romantic thoughts, romanticism, how it has created a soil for romanticism, romantic period, or the romantic ideology. Exactly. Then we had a brief introduction to romantic period. Now, in this, we talked about background, exactly the social, political, and economical things, elements, incidents that influence romantic thoughts. Yeah. Then we talked about the themes, major characteristics of romantic period. Also, we had a brief account of the major works by the poets, prose and fiction, particularly highlighting the major works by the major poets, major novelists, and major contributors, critics permanently. We also talked about the characteristics of romantic period in detail. And in the second half of our lecture, we have talked about the pre-romantic, exactly, uh, we can say uh, pre-romantic writers, exactly. And now we have talked about the literally uh, romantic writers, and particularly from the first generation, highlighting more on William Wordsworth, exactly. Let's say uh, first generation writers, or we can say poets from romantic period, right? So we have talked about those many things in our today's lecture. Fine. uh, Now we are going to continue with the further writers from first generation, second generation, from prose section, poetry section prominently, and the critical background of this romantic period entirely, because this period remains a remarkable period in case of understanding the history of English literature, exactly, and before how it has in a way, again, as the neoclassical period, age of sensibility has laid foundation for romantic period. Further, romantic period itself has laid foundation for the Victorian period, exactly, the new ideas that got emerged. That is going to be a part of our discussion in our upcoming lecture for sure, but till now this is what we have discussed so far. And so let us conclude our today's lecture on this note, right? And We'll continue with our discussion in our upcoming lecture series for sure. Till then, have a fantastic weekend ahead. Thank you.